Well, good evening. We're back again. We're going to be looking at Chapter 6 tonight in our general class upgrade sequence. And tonight is going to be digital modes, Chapter 6. But before we get started, I wanted to share a little diagram here. And if you understand this diagram, you'll know a lot about how digital works, okay? So here it is. We've got a guy trying to talk to his duck. The duck just kind of looks confused. So first of all, he tries to talk to the duck in German. The duck ignores him. Spanish, same thing. French, same thing. And then the guy says quack. And then the duck says quack. And then they can carry on their conversation by quacking at each other. Well, digital modes in ham radio are a lot like that. You have to be transmitting and receiving the same language in order to communicate. So I thought that was a good preliminary thing to look at. Again, I've put the ARRL resources on the slide here. And there's a ton of stuff here that goes above and beyond what we talk about in class. And what I would encourage you to do is just look at these resources and flip through the table of contents. You might find something there that's interesting or goes a little bit further than what we talked about in class. And then there's also a glossary there that's excellent. And I always include my contact information, so I'm happy to hear from any of you. There's 5 sections in Chapter 6. It starts out with basics of digital modes. You already know how to quack. So here we got a picture of a Boy Scout or a Cub Scout talking. He wants to be successful. And you may remember this because we talked about it before. This is a picture of an AM signal with a carrier, an upper sideband, and a lower sideband. And the reason that I wanted to review this is because all of the digital modes that we're going to be talking about are going to be fitting into this space of one single sideband area, or the single sideband isn't really channels, but it's about 3 kilohertz for a single sideband, and everything we talk about in terms of digital modes are going to be within the same constraints. In fact, digital modes are regulated as voice emissions by the FCC. That might seem kind of odd at first, but because we're sending tones to the transmitter, and they're being sent on sideband, that's why they're regulated as voice modes. So all of these modes, we'll be talking about, I think, all of these tonight. And some of you have heard about, since you're all technicians, D-Star, System Fusion, DMR, and so forth. And here's FreeDV. We were talking about that earlier. All of these modes are regulated as voice modes, and these you'll see on 2 meters, and probably have radios that have that capability. This one's kind of amazing. Slow-scan TV is also sent as audio tones. We'll get into that in some depth in the extra class. Slow-scan TV is just the concept of sending images. They have that capability on the space station, and hams can trade pictures between themselves in faraway places. So that's also handled as a voice mode. So we're going to concern ourselves with how to get from the digital ones and zeros of digital to tones that wind up getting transmitted on the air. No blue text yet. So maximum data rates and bandwidths are specified by the FCC rules, because if you go too fast, you take up too much space, and they want to keep you within the space of a single sideband transmission. And digital codes have to be public, with the exception of control of model aircraft and satellite control. Other than that, all digital codes have to be public. So how do we do that? Well, we have something called a sound card, and you'll see the term sound card just appear repeatedly anytime we're talking about digital transmission and reception. So let's dive into that a little bit to see what it is. We've got a picture of one from an old computer here. It's actually a physical sound card that plugs into a slot in the computer. So we can have digital here and analog out. The problem is data is ones and zeros. Audio is analog. We need analog audio in order to modulate a single sideband transmitter. Therefore, we need digital to analog conversion for the computer to radio to make our transmitted audio, and we need to go the other direction from the receive audio to convert it to ones and zeros so that our software can understand it. That all happens as a result of using what we're calling a sound card. It's very similar. This might help make the connection. If you play an audio CD on a computer or use the microphone input to record notes, that's using this same functionality. Well, this same functionality is exactly what we need for ham radio, digital. So the sound card will do digital to analog for a CD, takes the pits from the CD and converts those to audio in the sound card. Analog to digital conversion for a microphone, and that's exactly what we need for amateur digital. So hopefully this direct example, like a CD, will help clarify that. There's one more piece, though, that we need for ham radio, and that's something called a driver file, or audio driver. In our computer, we have a speaker, and we may have a microphone connection. Well, we need to redirect those audio streams into digital so that we can go back and forth between the computer and our radio. And it's the audio driver software that achieves that. So where might this conversion happen? Well, there's really three places that it typically happens. It can happen inside the computer. That's our sound card here. Today, though, pretty much all computers that have an onboard sound card, that's a chipset that's on the motherboard of the computer. You really don't see these anymore except for some very specialized applications. So it can be an actual sound card, it can be a chipset on the computer motherboard. You can have an external digital interface. Some of you have probably heard of Signal Links and some of the other ham radio products that are out there, Rig Expert, Microham, Yaesu. Now, some people like the idea of an external sound card or digital audio interface because there's knobs and buttons and indicators that they like to be able to see. The downside is that it winds up being kind of a cabling mess because you got to go from the computer to the interface and then from the interface to a transmit and a receive path out of the transceiver. And then the third one is inside the radio. So here's a diagram of a ICOM 7300, and pretty much all modern transceivers have a sound card actually built into the radio. And what's cool about that is all you need is a USB cable from your computer to the radio, and you don't need to worry about any of this stuff. You don't need to worry about other cables and so forth. The level controls, though, have to be set in software, so that's why some people still prefer these. So where can we find digital activity? Well, this, I believe, is in our book someplace. Yeah, page 6-2. And it shows where to find digital activity on the various ham bands. It tends to be on the higher part of the CW segment, CW/data segment. So I've got one item marked in blue here on 20 meters, 14070. We'll be coming back to that number. It'll help you with a couple of pool questions. So if you're just curious to hear some weird sounds, what does digital sound like, you can tune your radio to these parts of the bands to hear some of that stuff. Now, here's a listing of FT8 frequencies. FT8 is one of the modes we're going to be talking about. You notice that on some of the bands, the default, or the watering holes, the place where people go to communicate, on 40 meters, you'll notice that 074 keeps appearing over and over again. So if you can kind of remember the .074, that'll answer one or two pool questions for you. And there's specifically one that asks about 20 meters. And it goes something like this: common location for FT8, approximately 18074, or 14074 to 14077. You'll notice that's about 3 kilohertz. The FT8 area is taking up the space of one single sideband transmission. That 3 kilohertz, though, if you think about it, is quite a bit of bandwidth. And since FT8 only requires 50 hertz to operate, you can get about 5 dozen FT8 signals in the space, in this space right here, which is pretty amazing. We'll elaborate on that a little bit. Now, I've made one note here on 60 meters. We're going to expand on this a little bit later. The FCC changed some rules, so one of the former 60-meter channels was changed, and as of just a couple of weeks ago, this frequency, which used to be the default FT8 frequency, most hams have moved up to this frequency. Because the way that the change was made, this you can only run like 9.15 watts. I don't know who can measure that. So a lot of hams have moved up to the next available channel so they can run 100 watts. But I'll elaborate on that a little bit more. Most of you aren't going to probably be operating on 60 meters as you're getting started, but if you do, you just need to be aware of that. Digital voice, we talked about some that you see in a lot of the 2-meter marketing documents, DMR, D-Star, System Fusion. So there is one poll question that asks, which of the following provide digital voice modes? And these 3 will be listed there. There's a digital voice system from AOR, FreeDV. FreeDV was mentioned a little bit earlier. Public domain and open source, just things to know about. You may not use them, but they're there. Now we're going to get into more of the hows and the why-fors and some of this stuff. So frequency shift keying is the first thing we're going to look at, and it's going to be in the context of a radio teletype. That way we can connect to something that's real. And it consists of 2 different tones shifting from one frequency to another. And they're fairly high frequency tones. It's typically 2125 hertz, 2295, and they're jumping back and forth between those 2. And here's a spectrum display of some RTTY, radio teletype activity. And you'll notice that there's these two little spikes here on each one of these signals. And that represents the 2 tones that I mentioned. So the 2 separate frequencies of an FSK signal are identified as mark and space. Mark represents a 1. Space represents a 0. And here's some different modulation methods to make that happen. And what it will look like on the air is something like this. Some interesting ham radio history. Why are they called mark and space? Well, back in the old days, we're talking late 1800s, the early CW worked by taking a pen and dropping it down on a moving piece of paper roll. And when the pen would come down and touch the paper, that would be a mark. When the pen was lifted off the paper, that was called a space. And that original terminology stayed with us all the way through today. So the 2 tones that we use in radio teletype are still called mark and space, even though no pens and paper rolls are involved. So I just thought that was really interesting. Well, we just talked basics, and we're already into some questions. In what segment of the 20-meter band are most digital mode operations commonly found? And hopefully you remember my shortcut.
D? Delta?
Yep. My shortcut was remember .070. There's a couple of questions I think where that's going to help you here. So you don't have to go memorizing all of these bands and frequencies. Just go for the 070 and you'll have the right answer. Which of the following modes provides digital voice?
Charlie. Delta, sorry.
Yeah, the other Charlie. No, it's Delta, DMR, D-Star, and System Fusion, right. How are the 2 separate frequencies of a frequency shift keyed signal identified? Delta. Mark and space, yes. How is, now I bolded a couple of words here because there's a little shortcut that might help you. How is, and it won't be this way on your test, how is direct binary FSK modulation generated? Bravo, by changing an oscillator's frequency directly with a digital control signal. So what's happening is we're sending highs and lows from a computer to a connection on the back of your transceiver, and that will cause this binary frequency shift keying to occur. We're going to get into more methods of generating that in future classes, but that's all we need to know for now. That was quick. Now we're on to the second of 5 sections. We're going to be talking about character-based modes, and then after this section we'll be talking about packet-based modes. Now the concept of, well, let me move on here. The concept of a character mode is that if you press the letter A on your keyboard at your computer and you're talking to somebody across the country using the same software, an A will magically appear on their screen. So that's what we mean by character modes. Each character I type appears on the opposite side as I'm typing those characters. So this is considered a keyboard-to-keyboard mode. Radio teletype falls into that category. And it originally used mechanical teleprinters. And some hams, when these started coming available on the surplus market, interfaced them to some electronics to talk to a radio transmitter and receiver, and were able to press them into service in the amateur radio area. So it's still in use on the HF amateur bands, and where it's really, really hot and heavy, there's RTTY contests, RTTY contests, and there's people that just specialize in those, and they love them. They make hundreds and hundreds of contacts over the number of hours of the contest. I want to do that, but I haven't gotten into it yet. I've probably made half a dozen RTTY contacts just using the software that's built into my radio, but I haven't automated that yet and computerized it. So radio teletype is one. Another one is PSK31. It's a good weak signal mode that isn't very wide in terms of bandwidth. It's very capable of using low transmitter power and very narrow bandwidth. We'll talk more about that. Now, there's kind of a unique sound that a teletype printer makes, the old mechanical ones, and I'll share that with you here. If this works. There we go. I'm going to find my mouse. There's my mouse. Is that going up here? Okay. So you can see that this goes back a little bit. We've got a couple of clocks on the wall with different time zones. Got a lady operating the teletype machine, the terminal, the mechanical teleprinter. And that's what it sounds like. It used to be that you would hear these things.
We can't hear it.
Oh,
Is it working now?
I can hear it.
Okay. You kind of get some clattering away going on in the background as the machine is running.
NBC News with David Richardson.
That's exactly right. Yeah, the newsrooms way back in the 50s and 60s thought this was so cool. They would be broadcasting these sounds just to make them sound official. So that's what it sounded like. And it's now ham radio. We use it using software. We don't have to use these mechanical printers. I was at a ham fest a couple of years ago where somebody had restored a whole bunch of these things, and it was amazing to see them all working. I wish I would have got some video. All right, now we're going to get into some definitions. So I had to bring out a dictionary. So a bit is a fundamental unit of data, a 0 or a 1. Does anybody know what bit stands for? Stands for, or where the term came from? Well, I'll have to give it to you then. It's binary digit. Binary digit, 1 or a 0. That's a bit. Now the bit rate, number of digital bits per second sent from one computing system to the other. All right, so far, so good. Okay, now here we're going to put a fly in the ointment. Symbol is a characteristic of the transmitted signal that represents data. We'll just take that by faith for now. Now, baud is the number of symbols sent per second, which is the symbol rate. So we've got a symbol rate and a bit rate. Now, it is possible for a symbol to represent more than one bit. We'll show some examples of that coming up. Now here's a picture, and sometimes when I put this picture up, Gary raises his hand with 2 fingers, which he's doing right now. We're going to explain why he's doing that. All right, so let's consider this now. If you hold up one hand, that is one signaling event or a symbol. But your hand can have different numbers of fingers raised. All right, so a signaling event can represent 6 states, including a closed hand, 0 through 5 fingers. And the electronic equivalent of that are phase shifts, individual discrete tones being sent, or discrete levels, how loud the tone is. And the FCC regulates symbols per second, maximums on specific bands. So we'll expand on that a little bit more. So here we are, we're in a noisy room, and I'm over by the where the food is being served, and Gary raises 1 finger. So the 1 finger means bring me a Coke. 2 fingers, which he's waving around, says bring me a Coke and a cheeseburger. So in each case, he's only sent 1 symbol, but he can convey different kinds of information. Now we're going to make this get a lot more complicated in the next slide. And you can just kind of let this pass. There aren't any pool questions about it, but you might be wondering how 5 bits can be used in practicality. Well, here's a finger, and we've assigned values to each one: 1, 2, 4, 8, and 16. So here's some decimal numbers, and this is the binary equivalent. So if you had all of your fingers raised and you added all of these up, you'd come up with 32. So you can have up to 32 bits, which is also 2 to the 5th, the number of your fingers. And can you imagine how difficult this would be if Gary and I were trying to communicate this way? Because I had to say, well, how many fingers? Okay, and which finger represents what number? And it would take me so long to figure that out that I'd miss the next one when it was being sent. But this is child's play for a computer. So if you can send these symbols, the computer can very quickly figure out what the digital equivalent is of that, or the decimal equivalent of those digital bits. So in this case, a symbol rate of 1 per second, which is the same as baud, symbol rate in baud is the same thing, could represent a bit rate of 32 bits per second. So now I'm hoping that you're starting to see the relationship there. A symbol is something that we change in the way that we transmit something, and the number of bits per change represents the number of bits per second that we can send. We've got another example of that coming up. I don't know if any of you remember the old modems when they first came out. Anybody that had a 300 baud modem that would, Gary's raising his hand, I had one too. That was so cool because you could talk on CompuServe or AOL. There were a number of services that you could hook up your computer to and transmit email that way over a telephone line. So the very early ones just had 2 states, probably just a tone shift from one to another one, and that could handle 300 bits per second. 300 baud, 300 symbols, but only 2 states, 300 bits per second. Then they went to 4, 8, and 32, and you can see that the bits per second just climbed and climbed and climbed. And you were the ultimate on your block. You were the best kid on your block if you could get up to a 56K modem, and those came out in the end. That wound up being about the limit that a phone line could handle. And I just wanted to kind of illustrate here that the number of states that are being sent, might be tone shifts or phase shifts, will generate many more bits per second than the baud rate being used. More definitions. I've still got the dictionary out here. We've got the concept of a duty cycle. Now, a duty cycle is really the percentage of time that a transmitter is turned on compared to all of the time available. So if you were sending, for example, Morse code where you're doing dots and dashes, your duty cycle would just be the amount of time that the key is pressed. Most of the time the key would not be pressed, so the duty cycle would be fairly low. Ratio of time that the transmitter is on to the total of on time and off time. Now, protocol, another definition, these are the rules by which one system can communicate with another. We're going to be talking about start bits and stop bits and how these things are formatted and linked together. That's a protocol, rules that control the method used to exchange data. And the mode is the combination of a protocol with a modulation method, such as radio teletype or PSK31. And there aren't any pool questions about this, but it's just helpful to know how this all comes together. Still no pool questions. Okay, protocol, set of rules that control the encoding, packaging, and exchanging and decoding of digital data. Touched on that. Specifies how the information is constructed and exchanged. How errors are detected and managed. The method of modulation, generally chosen by agreement within the ham community. So single sideband or FM for packet radio. Frequency shift keying or audio frequency shift keying for radio teletype, and we're going to get into that in more detail. Here's an example. FT8, the most popular digital mode that's out there today, is 8-tone frequency shift keying sent via normally a USB cable between your computer and your radio if the radio has an internal sound card.
And upper sideband.
Upper sideband, regardless of the band that you're on. More on frequency shift keying. We already identified mark and space a little earlier. Oh, finally some blue text. The two separate frequencies of a FSK signal are called mark and space. I think you knew that, but this is in the context now of the pool question. The most common frequency shift for RTTY is 170 hertz. I mentioned this in passing earlier. Mark space is generally 2125 hertz. Kind of a high audio frequency, and a space is 2295, and it's shifting back and forth between those two, and the difference between them is 170 hertz. That's where this comes from in the pool question. It's the frequency shift. We saw this picture, and here's a signal and how it winds up modulating a transmitter. Now here's something that's sometimes controversial in ham circles, and I'll tell you why. So frequency shift keying generation. The frequency of the transmitter's VFO, variable frequency oscillator, is controlled directly by a digital data signal from the computer. So we've got our USB cable from the computer to the radio, and that's going to be sharing digital ones and zeros that are going to directly shift the transmitter oscillator between those two frequencies. Now that's his direct FSK. VFO is controlled directly by a digital data signal from the computer. Now there's something called audio frequency shift keying. In this case, we're going to be generating audio tones in the computer sound card, or the signal from the computer to the radio if the sound card is internal to the radio. And audio tones are used to modulate an SSB or FM transmitter through the microphone input. So we're treating it as an audio signal rather than actually shifting the carrier frequency. Some disadvantages or things to be careful of, though, with audio frequency shift keying, the audio must be free of noise, because if there's a microphone in parallel with it, that would be picking up junk. ALC and compression must not be used. Now you might recall that automatic level control and compression are good things when you're talking in single sideband, but they will distort the digital data. So that's why they have to be turned off. So these are concerns for audio frequency shift keying. If you have an older radio, another advantage of audio frequency shift keying is that it can be done with any radio that's out there, no matter how old it is. You just have to have an interface to it. Direct FSK just works on the more modern transceivers. And the reason that it's controversial, some hams say that one is much better than the other. And to a certain extent that's true, because there's a lot of things you have to make sure are right when you're using audio frequency shift keying. Levels, and make sure that the noise isn't there, and all of this has to be addressed. But the truth of the matter is, if this is set up correctly, you can't tell the difference at all on the receiving side. So they're both equally as good, but this one's just a little bit more futzy in terms of getting it set up. So here's RTTY again. This uses what's called the Baudot code. It encodes each text character as a sequence of 5 bits. You'll see that I've got 5 bits emphasized in multiple places here. That'll help you with a complicated pool question. RTTY, sequence of 5 bits. Now, because the receiving teleprinter does not know when you're going to start transmitting, we need to use something called a start bit. So we're going to send a start bit from the transmitting end, and that tells the receiving end, start paying attention. Very specifically, pay attention to the next 5 things that are going to happen. So an initial bit, the start bit, and an inter-character pause, the stop bit, are used to synchronize the transmitting and receiving stations. Otherwise, they wouldn't know when to start paying attention and when to stop. Now here's a picture of a paper tape, and I've got one over here on the calculator cam. This is the one that I got from the Hamfest that I mentioned. And this is probably the reason they were giving away, is because these holes aren't punched very cleanly. But here's the text going across the top, is that the ACLU did not alert government, etc. So everything underneath there represents a series of punches in the tape. So the way that this would work, you could go to a telegraph office and ask that you send a message. So they would encode it onto a tape. They could put this tape then into a teleprinter, and it would send that message across the country for you. So this is what one looks like with the holes properly punched. Remember 5 bits? That's going to come up again. Well, let's find one that looks like it's got this one here that I've got circled in red. 1, 2, 3. Okay, 1, 2, 3. The 5 bits there, and they're all punched. So it's easy to see that there's 5 bits there. Now notice, remember from our fingers, okay, 5 bits could represent up to 32 states. Now what's the problem with this? If you want uppercase and lowercase letters, well, there's 26 characters in the alphabet. And if you do uppercase and lowercase, you now have twice that number. So it's more than 5 bits can handle. So the first thing that happens in radio teletype, everything is sent lowercase. But what about numbers? If we've used 26 letters, now we want to add 10 numbers and other symbols, we don't have enough space. So there was an ingenious method used here. They've got 2 codes here, letters and figures. So we're happily sending letters. And now we need to send numbers or some of these special symbols. So what we're going to do is send we'll switch between letters and figures. So if we send a figures code, then the next set of transmitted characters are going to be down here. You can see we got the 9 numbers and some other various things down there, including a bell tone. The old teleprinters would have a bell. Sometimes as you were listening to that thing clacking away, you would hear it ding. Well, that's the shifted J character. It'll ring the bell on the other side. So that's how this works. Let's look a little bit further now at the letter D. So we'll have a diagram coming up on that. So a D is 1, 0, 0, 1, 0. Try to remember that, 1, 0, 0, 1, 0. We're going to see how we can use that, what it looks
You might
like.
point out the little hole there in the middle is the sprocket.
Oh yeah, when you put this on a machine to send it, the sprocket holes will engage with a wheel, and that'll pull it through at an even rate of speed. Yeah, thanks, I forgot that. All right, a little bit more about RTTY now. RTTY, radio teletype, uses a Baudot code, 5 bits for encoding the data, 32 different characters max. Not enough for the entire upper and lowercase English alphabet, numbers and punctuation. So 2 special codes, letters and figures. They're used to switch between the 2 sets, increasing the number of available characters to 62. We touched on all of that, and here's another picture of a tape. This one's punched a little bit more cleanly. And here we've got our picture of our letters and figures code, and we saw this already. Now on an HF radio, the most common speeds, because there's a number of different speeds that are possible, and these are all set in software, but the most common one used by hams is 45. Common speeds are, and this is in terms of words per minute here, most radio teletype conversations on HF are conducted at 45 baud, and the most common shift between the mark and space frequency is 170 hertz. We saw this a little bit earlier, just reinforcing it and putting it in the context of the poll question. And you must match your speed and shift to communicate with the other RTT station. So it's how you're quacking on one end versus how you're interpreting the quacks on the other end. I love that picture. Gary Larson was I think there was something funny about his head. I don't know how he came up with all that stuff. All right, so let's look at this a little more. 5-bit Baudot is a 5-bit code with an additional start and stop bit incorporated. So let's start off here. We've got our mark frequency and our space frequency. So when we shift, and it's idling with the mark frequency. So when the mark goes from 2125 to 2295, that corresponds to a 1 going to a 0. And that is a start bit. So on the receiving end, it sees a start bit and it says, I have got to pay attention to the next 5 things that happen. So the next thing that's going to happen, we're going to go from a space tone to a mark tone. That signifies the beginning of a 1. We go back down again, the end of this time period, and we're going to stay low. So we're not going to change mark and space tones for the space of 2 characters. So you can see how we've got a 1, 0, 0. Then we're going to shift again from space to mark, signifying a 1. And come down again, go to 0. 1, 0, 0, 1, 0. That was our letter D. Data bits for a D with a start bit and a stop bit. You'll see the stop bit is a little bit longer. It's about 1.5 time periods here. That's how the other end knows that it can stop listening. So that's our letter D that we sent. Here we've got our tone difference of 170 hertz, just to reinforce that. And again on HF, it's usually sent at 45 baud, which corresponds to 60 words per minute approximately. So here's an entire picture. Now let's see how that's transmitted. We can see how mark and shift is moving. Let's see what it looks like. So here's the digital signals, the 1s and the 0s coming along, and here's the transmitted RF. So what's happening is we have this going on, and at this point we're going to reverse the phase. When that phase reversal happens, that's interpreted as a change in state here. So here's another change in state. Here's another one that changes state, but then it doesn't do anything for more than 1 bit width. And you can start to get a picture of how this is working. So this is how we're changing the phase of a transmitted signal.
So this is phase shift keying as opposed to what we were looking for in radio teletype, which was frequency shift keying.
Right, and both of them are used. I kind of shifted gears on you from radio teletype to phase shift keying, but you can see what the effect is here. We're changing the phase of a signal where we're changing the tones of the signal for radio teletype. Just a review of our radio teletype image again. A little bit more on phase shift keying, which we introduced a couple of slides ago. The generic term is PSK. And there's different modes. There's PSK 31 and 63 and different flavors. So rather than changing tones, the phase of one tone is shifted. That's what this picture was we saw a minute ago. We'll discuss 2 types. Now, they're binary phase shift keying. That's where you just switch states from one phase to another. And then something called quadrature phase shift keying, where we actually have 4 different kinds of phase shifts, and I'll show those to you. So any kind of PSK signal, like the mode PSK31, that's actually binary phase shift keying. BPSK and PSK are synonymous in that sense. So these are used in amateur modes, PSK31 and QPSK31. The approximate baud rate is 31. That's where the PSK31 comes from. So 31 stands for the symbol rate of the protocol. It's actually about 31.25, but we call it 31. And here's a new concept. PSK uses a variable length code called varicode that assigns shorter codes to common characters and longer codes for others. Now you might know that the letter E is the most commonly used letter in the English language. So it would be really nice if we could use a very short code to represent the letter E. The letter Z or Y or Q could be longer codes. And if we can use shorter codes for some of the characters, we can get more throughput, more efficient coding. So the number of data bits sent in a single PSK31 character will vary. That's why it's called varicode. Uppercase letters use longer varicode bit sequences and thus slow down transmission. So people who are using PSK31 will usually always, they'll never be sending capital letters unless there's a need to. Now here's the original varicode, Morse code. I've shown this to experienced extras in the past who had never seen anything like this before. So you're in for a treat here. How does this work? We're going to talk in terms of Morse code. Well, when you're at a shopping center, a lot of times there's a map there that says you are here. Well, in this case, it says start here. So we're starting here. Our Morse code key is up. We're going to just press it down once. That's the letter E, or a DIT, as it's called. So it's very easy to send the letter E, which happens to be the most common letter in the English language. It can happen very quickly. On the other hand, a T is a single dash. Let's go to the other end of the map now and look at something more complicated like a J. A J is a lot nastier, okay, in Morse code. That's dot, dash, 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 or you'd say it da-da-da-da. Takes a lot longer to send. So that's the concept of using the most common letters for the shortest codes being sent. This came from 1844. Morse and Vail came up with this. That's cool. Now, you may have, I'm sure you've heard of uppercase letters and lowercase letters. Well, what does that mean exactly? Well, here's a printer's typecase. And the way that Morse came up with what codes to use for which letters was by examining a typecase. So here's E. Notice that the box that contains E's is the biggest box that's there, because we use them most frequently. And the other boxes are varying sizes depending upon how frequently the letters are used. So the concept of uppercase and lowercase that we still use today, lowercase is down here. You'll see if you want capital letters, those are in the upper half of the typecase. They're called uppercase. So it's another little interesting piece of trivia that has found its way into our modern usage. A little bit more now on binary phase shift keying. We introduced this earlier. Binary FSK is just two values of phase shift, 0 and 180 degrees. So here we've got we see we've got phase shifts happening, and each phase shift will change the representation of the data being sent. So the amateur mode that uses this is PSK31, runs at 31 baud. That's the symbol rate. This whole mechanism was invented by a Brit a long time ago when PSK31 first came out. It took the amateur radio community by storm. Everybody loved it. It was being just used extensively. It's not being used so much anymore, but it was really the first extremely popular data mode, other than, I guess you could say, radio teletype. And then we've got something called quadrature phase shift keying. Looks like we got about 4 pool questions on this. So quadrature phase shift keying, or quadrature PSK, is a modulation in which the digital data is transmitted using, instead of 0 and 180, we've got 0, 90, 180, 270 degree phase shifts to represent, instead of 1 bit, each one will represent 2 bits. Characteristics, because QPSK31 uses 2 tones, it is sideband sensitive. Now, what does that mean? You're probably wondering, well, remember the picture we showed you of an AM signal with an upper sideband and a lower sideband? Well, if that transmission contained 2 tones, the lower tone would be closer to the carrier. So on lower sideband and upper sideband, the tones would be flipped in frequency. So because we've got 2 tones in use, that makes it sideband sensitive. The encoding provides error correction. Now, because there's many more bits that can be sent with a QPSK, some of those bits can be used for error detection, error correction. And the good thing is its bandwidth is approximately the same as BPSK31. There's a really extensive article on Wikipedia, which is here. And every time that I do one of these classes, I always go through and make sure that all of the links work. So when you get this tomorrow, get the file tomorrow from Gary, you can activate any of these links. So here's a picture. And here we see the 2 bits associated with each phase shift down in the bottom. So we hit that at a very high level, but if you can just take a minute to review the blue text here, it'll help you when we get to the pool questions.
And I'll just make a comment for anyone watching on YouTube that just dropped in. You can find the link to Dropbox in the description box on the web page for this YouTube video. And so that'll take you to this information tomorrow as well.
Yep, very, very helpful. Probably the most frequent question that Gary and I get from students that are kind of stumbling into our videos is, where can I get the handouts? Where can I get the videos? And he just gave us the answer. They're all in that description section on the YouTube. So I thought you might be interested in hearing what some of these things sound like on the air if you've never heard them before. So I'm going to switch this. And let's listen to what radio teletype. Some people call this the deedle-deedle sound. See if you can figure out why. Hopefully that's going out. Put on, all right. JT65, which we haven't talked about yet. Kind of an eerie sounding signal. PSK31, which we've been talking about. Another flavor. And then this one I really like. I remember when I first heard this, I was really baffled. Isn't that cool? And then I also have a link here to a sound library. We'll open that up.
The last one done like Space Invaders.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Okay, so we don't need this silly thing. Oops, that's the wrong one. All right, so here's all kinds of digital modes, all described here. I'll bet you didn't know there were so many. And then you can listen to any of them over here. So I wondered, do you have a chance to hear some of those things? And how can I learn more? You're wondering, how can I get started? Well, this book, let me get my mouse back, going between 2 screens here. This book is now in its 3rd edition. I own all 3 of them, and it's vastly, vastly improved in the 3rd edition. Getting on the Air with HF Digital. Here's an Amazon link. Be sure to get the 3rd edition. There's a lot of times used books can be obtained much at a better price, but you want the 3rd edition. So that will give you an introduction to a lot of the different modes that you can use. But my top number 1 recommendation is find somebody that's already doing this and kind of team up with them. Go over to their shack, see how they're doing it. This will help you. And then there's a software reference for digital modes that's also an excellent reference. So all of these links will be working in the file you get tomorrow. All right, exam questions now for radio teletype and phase shift keying. Which of the following describes the Baudot code? Charlie. Yep, 5, which I've bolded. What is the most common frequency shift for RTTY emissions in the amateur HF bands?
Bravo.
170 hertz. And that's all controllable in software, but that's normally the default. Which type of code is used for sending characters in a PSK31 signal? Alpha, it's vary code. Which of the following statements is true about PSK31?
Bravo.
Uppercase letters use longer varicode symbols and thus slow down transmission. What is QPSK modulation?
Delta.
Delta modulation, in which digital data is transmitted at 0, 90, 180, and 270 degree phase shifts to represent pairs of bits. So you can send a lot more data that way. Which of the following is a characteristic of QPSK31?
Delta.
Yes. Alpha is correct, Bravo is correct, Charlie's correct, so all of these choices are correct. All right, we'll be moving on to section 6.3. We have 5 sections, we just have a couple to go. Packet-based modes and systems. Here's where things get really interesting. Understanding the character-based modes was pretty simple. You type an A on your end and an A shows up at the other end. With packet, however, each one of these little boxes on the bottom is what's called a byte. There's between 7 and 9 bits in each byte. And you can see that you can send an entire message at one time rather than one character at a time. And the way that it's set up, it typically will have a header and then what's called a payload. This is my message for you. And then at the end, something that's called a checksum. So the header at the start of the packet contains control, routing, and handling information. Where is this packet intended to be going? To whom am I speaking? Okay, put it that way. So synchronization patterns for the receiver are contained in the header, sort of corresponding to the start bit that we saw for radio teletype. Error detection and correction information can be contained in the header. So a packet refers to transmission of data in structured groups via packet radio frames. So here's a packet radio frame here. So the data, that's this part down here, or the payload, is the data be exchanged, often compressed for efficiency. The trailer or checksum over here, additional controller status information and data used for error detection. We saw that the header and the checksum both can contain error correction information. And the most common error detection is something called CRC, which is cyclic redundancy check. You don't need to know how that works, but you might hear the term, so I wanted to share it. So, and it's the result of a calculation. So if you added up the numeric values for all of these bytes, you'd come up with a number. And one of the simplest forms of error detection is to see if that number matches. It's much more complicated than that, but the whole concept of CRC is to determine if this data was received correctly and possibly fix it. Speaking of which, we've got something called forward error correction, or FEC. not FCC, FEC, transmits redundant information with the data. The receiver can correct data errors. Now, a real oversimplified way to view this, let's say that you sent the same byte of data 3 times someplace in this mess down here. So you've got opportunity number 1, opportunity number 2, and opportunity number 3. Let's say 2 of the 3 match. All right, pretty good chance that's the correct one. So that's a method where we can use redundant data to figure out what it should have been. It's much more complicated than that, but this is just a simplified example of how it might work. Transmits redundant information with the data. Receiver can correct data errors. Then another form of error correction is ARQ. In an automatic repeat request mode, or ARQ, it's helpful to remember what that means, a NAC response to a transmitted package causes a request to be for retransmission of the packet. NAC means not acknowledged. So we're going to send a packet. We're going to see if we received it correctly. If not, we're going to ask for a repeat. So forward error correction sends data with a bigger checksum. It's more there to help decode it. Now I've got a diagram of how this actually works here. So we've got a sender and a receiver. So the sender is going to send out a packet. The header, the payload, and the checksum or trailer is going to send a packet to the receiver. Here comes the data to the receiver. All right, the receiver is going to analyze it and say, it's okay, I got it. So that it could then send an acknowledgement back to the sender. The sender now knows that it would be okay to send the next packet, so that's what happens. Here comes the next packet. Receiver's going to look at it, said, uh-oh, I can't figure out what that was. So what's it going to do? It'll send a NAC, not acknowledged, and the automatic repeat request is implied in that. So what does the sender do? The sender says, okay, didn't get that one, I'm going to resend it. Receiver gets it, it's okay, and now the sequence is complete for that much of it. Of course, there's many more of these happening at once. This was just a simplified explanation of how that works. Automatic repeat request. So if there's too many errors, well, before we get to that, this only works in the context of one sender and one receiver. Let's assume that there was one ham sending out these packets to multiple hams out here. Well, ham number 1 might have received it okay. Ham number 2 might have not received it okay, and there would be so many ACKs and NACs floating around that the sender would be totally confused. So this only works in the context of one sender and one receiver. That's an important concept. Now, PACTOR is an ARQ protocol. Therefore, 2 pool questions coming up here. Joining an existing contact is not possible. Well, why isn't it possible? Because this only works in the context of one sender and one receiver. Therefore, you can't butt into the conversation. Oops, too fast on the finger. Secondly, PACTOR connections are limited to 2 stations, which we talked about here, but this is in the context of the pool questions. So now you understand that perfectly, right? You could design one. Now, we've been going for about an hour. This would be a perfect time, I think, to take a break, and then we're going to come back and talk about WinLink, which is basically email over ham radio, which is super, super cool. But we'll do that after our break. So we'll take 5 minutes, stretch your legs, get a drink. I'm certainly going to do that, and then we'll be back with you. Okay, we're back. So hopefully you did something interesting during your break, like inventing a new protocol or something like that. Okay, WinLink, I mentioned this is email over ham radio, very commonly used in emergency communications. During field day, if you're involved or will be involved in field day, you can earn extra points for sending WinLink email messages to your section manager or emergency coordinator. So we did that in our field day last year. I was the one that was actually doing the WinLink, so that was a first for me. So WinLink is an infrastructure for connecting amateur stations to remote message servers, which is RMS, and international common message servers via the internet. And I'll have a diagram of that coming up. Another name for a remote message server is a gateway, because the concept is we send a message to a gateway or to a message server, and it's a gateway to the internet. So if you can make that connection in your mind, this one will pop out at you. Wow, a whole bunch of blue here. WinLink is an amateur radio wireless network to send and receive email on the internet. It's a form of packet radio, which we've talked about, a wireless network capable of both VHF and HF band operation. So WinLink has applications developed specifically for HF and VHF. Catch all of these. Now, WinLink requires a hardware or software modem to connect the radio to the WinLink infrastructure. So we've got to be sending ones and zeros through the air to the message server. So one way of doing this, there's two ways that have been very popular. One is called PACTOR, Packet Teletype over Radio is what it stands for. PACTOR uses a hardware modem, or some people call that a TNC, Terminal Network Controller. So PACTOR uses a hardware modem. The issue here, though, is that these are proprietary. And if you want to buy a PACTOR modem, you're usually north of $1,000. So even though PACTOR does a wonderful job of transmitting data over ham radio, it's pretty expensive. Somebody, it was a Brit, I have his name here, I guess I don't. VARA is a software modem. In other words, it runs on your computer. So VARA is a digital protocol used with WinLink, and it's almost free compared to PACTOR. Turns out that there's two flavors of VARA software modem. One is free, it runs at lower data speeds, and then they have a version, if you pay a $69 licensing fee, you can go to full speed, and it's competitive with PACTOR, roughly speaking, almost as fast. So most EMCOM folks, people that do emergency communications work, have all pretty much converted over to VARA and WinLink. So WinLink Express is the email client part of the messaging client, and then VARA is the software modem. So it's what most hams are using now, WinLink Express plus VARA. That's what I used to send our field day messages, what I used for our messages last year. And there's two different flavors of the software, VARA HF, which does what you would expect, high frequency bands, and then VARA FM for VHF. We can run higher data speeds on VHF. That's why there's differences in the software. Now there's a program called VARA AC, which is a chat program that allows point-to-point messaging between two HF stations. So I promised you a picture. Well, here it is. Here's all of us down here, individual hams. These look like they're home locations, but this can be done from a portable station as well. So using either PACTOR or VARA HF or VHF, you transmit that message to these servers, the remote messaging servers. They're connected to the internet, and they go out to these servers that are located all over the world, USA, Southeast, Southwest, Canada, Europe, Australia. So used for amateur radio services. When we had the Puerto Rico disaster several years ago, they were just begging for hams that were willing to go there with their equipment and provide communications because everything else was down. no email, no cell phones, no public services, but hams could get through using WinLink. So WinLink is completely run by hams. It's used to transfer messages via the internet. This is also very popular in maritime communications as well. So that's the concept of WinLink. It's very cool. And here's a link to the
More background. The top boxes, the Southwest USA and Southeast USA,
Yep.
those were originally MCI companies. That MCI did all the telex lines to South America and a lot of the lines to Europe and Japan and stuff. So they were doing the translation. They'd be the gateway. And then the internet wasn't even around. It was just telex to telex and stuff. So when the internet came in, that made all the difference.
Yep, so this has got a long history. These servers are now in the Amazon cloud environment. So we've progressed to that stage. So the idea is if we're totally out of power in some part of the world, probably going to have power in other parts. Now we're going to shift gears again. We're doing a lot of gear shifting tonight. Hope we don't grind any of them. Grind your brain. So WSJT, a weak signal Joe Taylor is what that stands for. Joe Taylor, here's a smiling Joe Taylor down here. He was an astrophysicist, a Nobel Prize winner. He's kind of a smart guy, okay? So when he retired, he started doing all of this radio stuff, all right? So what are those modes? There's a whole family of modes. It's called WSJT-X. The X stands, excuse me, for experimental, but a lot of it's not experimental anymore. It's a full-fledged usage, but it's still called WSJT-X. So that includes the very first mode was FT8, or excuse me, JT65, Joe Taylor 65, used 65 tones. And it was designed for moon bounce, so very, very weak signals. So the family now includes FT8, which is the most popular digital mode out there, and its cousin FT4, JT9, and Whisper. We're going to be talking about Whisper coming up. And here we've got a robot. The robot's got a name, and his name is FT8. So all being done in an automated fashion. And these next couple of, this bullet is just incredible. These signals can operate 30 dB below the noise level, approaching 1,000 times less power than noise. So you can be transmitting using some of these modes. You can't even hear them on the air. They're so weak. Mentioned JT5 was developed for moon bounce. There's a problem in talking to the moon, all right? That problem is that there are no hams on the moon. So there's nobody you're going to get up to and have them answer you. So not only do you have to go the 239,000 rounded miles to the moon, but now you've got to get all the way back to Earth again. And when you consider that the Earth's circumference is only 24,900, about 25,000 miles, or from end to end, about 12,450, you can see that it is much easier to talk on the Earth. The distances are much shorter. You've got to go up to the ionosphere and back down. That'll be the subject of Chapter 8. But the moon is a long, long way away. This was extremely difficult before some of these modes were invented. Hams had to use humongous dish antennas, super cooled receive free amplifiers, and it was still almost impossible. These modes have made that possible. So you could do moon bounce if you want. I've never been enthused about doing that, but I think it's really cool. So what is FT8? A little bit more. It was released in 2017. And I got onto it in, I think, August of 2018, if I recall. It might have been 2017. But I was living in a location where I had very high noise. And about the only thing I could do was FT8, because everything was so noisy, I couldn't hardly make any contacts. So in the first couple of years I was running FT8, I probably got 4,000 or 5,000 contacts. I got worked all states and DXCC and a bunch of other things just using that. So it was written by Steve Frank and Joe Taylor. Steve has passed away. What are its features? Very narrow bandwidth, 50 hertz. So the sideband space is about 3 kilohertz. So if you do the math, you can get perhaps as many as 5 dozen signals in the space of a sideband channel.
Can we just show them on the Maestro?
Yeah, if we can do it in about 10 seconds.
Yeah, just take the Maestro. There's one 3 kilohertz bandwidth FT8 channel on 20 meters. Those are all individual 50 hertz signals.
Yep. So it's amazing how many you can jam in there. It was funny because when the FT8 first came out, hams were saying, this is going to ruin ham radio. You know, it's going to take over the bands. It takes a very small amount of space, and that hasn't proven to be true. What are the features? Very narrow bandwidth, 50 hertz. How does it work? It's 8 tones, spaced only 6 hertz apart. It's fairly fast. A transmit cycle is about 15 seconds. So you transmit for 15 seconds, you receive for 15 seconds, and this happens 2 or 3 times to complete the complete QSO, if you want to call it that. JT65 took almost a minute, 55 seconds, versus the 15 seconds with FT8. Now here's an example. Oh, first of all, let me explain this. There's a lot of people, and sometimes you see this on their QRZ page, bio, it says, I love FT8. Other people will put up a sign saying, I hate FT8. And I'll share some reasons why people feel that way. But relative signal-to-noise ratio for a single sideband signal, you need to be about 10 dB above the noise. For CW, you can be much, much weaker because you can discern the dots and dashes much more easily than you can the spoken language. FT8 goes down to minus 21. JT65, the original moon bounce, was even more sensitive. JT9 isn't used very much, but it's more sensitive, and Whisper, that we'll be talking about, goes down to minus 31 dB. So you can kind of get an idea of why this works so well with weak signals. So we see the difference between single sideband and FT8, minus 21 to plus 10, it's about 31 dB. So you could, another way of saying that would be 1 watt of FTA would be worth over 1,000 watts of single sideband. Another way to just look at the relative differences. Now here's some mode stats. I just kept the stats from last year, but look at them. This is the modes being used most heavily during the period of this report. This was March 11th through 18th, a year ago. So FT8, QSOs 621,000, CW 184,000, and the point of this is that FT8 is by far the most popular mode that's out there right now for number of contacts per hour. So you're probably going to want to get involved with this at some point. Now, why do some people love it? Well, because it can happen in a short time. It's kind of mindless because once you start a sequence, it automatically goes through a state of 4 or 5 flavors, and I'll show you a picture of that coming up too. So you can complete the conversation in about 2 minutes, minute and a half to 2 minutes. So 15-second blocks that are being transmitted will only support 13 characters. So in that 13 characters, you can manage to cram in a grid square and your call sign and a signal report. And there's an auto sequence. Once you have a conversation going, it's automated. It's an effective data rate of only 5 words per minute, but because it's so sensitive, it's worth the wait. So I got some blocks up here, 1, 2, 3. So FT8 is designed for the minimum information to qualify for a contact. It's not a conversation or rag chew mode, and that's why some people hate it. It's not real ham radio because I can't discuss the weather. I can't discuss my rheumatoid arthritis or the drugs that I'm on today or whatever. It's only just 3 things that it'll do. It'll typically exchanges call signs, grid location or grid square, and signal reports. All right, so this you need to know. Mentioned it's synchronized in 15 seconds of transmit followed by 15 seconds of receive. So the start times are at these points of the minute, 0, 15, etc. seconds. So a requirement, and this is really important, a requirement when using FT8, computer time accuracy has to be within approximately 1 second. And there's software that you can put on your computer that will automatically adjust your computer clock to keep it within 1 second. People that run FT8 typically have one of these programs running as well. It's an AFSK mode, audio frequency shift keying, which we talked about. The type of modulation used is tone frequency shift keying. They're coming at this in a bunch of different ways, but they're all pool questions, so I wanted you to see them now. Which of the following narrowband digital modes can receive signals with very low signal-to-noise ratios? And of the answers they give you, FT8 is the one we're looking for. This one is a little bit tricky, but I think when we talk about it, it'll jump out at you when you get to the pool question. A signal report of +3. And the signal reports in FT8 will range from about -24 to about +20 for a really strong signal. So a signal report of +3 means the signal-to-noise ratio is equivalent to +3 dB in a 2.5 kilohertz bandwidth. Well, what does that mean? The wider the bandwidth, the more noise there's going to be there. And because FT8 is only 50 hertz wide, you get a tremendous advantage right off the bat by its being so narrow. The other advantage is it's so sensitive in its decoding. So in terms of recognizing this in the pool question, it's a ratio equivalent to +3 dB in a 2.5 kilohertz bandwidth, kind of compared to a single sideband space. Frequencies in use. For FT8, all upper sideband, regardless of the band. I shared the hint earlier, the 074. We already had that question. There was a specific question related to data frequencies for 20 meters. And that's here. And this is the question. And then I have some text here about a new law that came into effect. There's 5 channels. See, and I've got a picture of that coming up here, and just I think it's the next slide. In fact, let me hold that so I can share that with you. So this new allocation on 60 meters, Gary shared most of this slide in his rules and regulations lesson.
I stole it.
He stole it from me, but that's okay. I steal things from him too. So there's happiness about this new allocation, and there's sadness. So effective just a couple of weeks ago, we wound up with the new rules for 60 meters. It's easier to see in a picture. So here's 60 meters. And if we look on our color chart, if you remember your famous color chart, or it's in our book too, because I didn't write the page number down here, but we had these 2.8 kilohertz channels, if you want to call them that, on 60 meters. So what the FCC did, and these were very specific, you had to be on these exact frequencies. So, and you could have 100 watts on any of these. So the new ruling took this middle one and said, okay, you can be anywhere within this space. It doesn't have to be channelized, but you can only transmit 9.15 watts effective radiated power. So where we could do 100 watts before on any of these, now we can only do 10 on just this one. So if I flip back now, that's what this means here. So most hams in the FT8 default frequency just happened to be this one right here. So where we used to be able to do 100 watts on the default FT8 frequency, now we got to crank that down to 9.15. So most people just go close to 10 and figure that they're legal. A lot of hams, though, have started using the next one up as the default FT8 frequency on 60 meters. Now, all of this might not mean a lot to you because you might not be active on FT8 and you might not be active on 60 meters when you first start out in your HF career, if you want to call it that. but just be aware that there are some special requirements on 60 meters. No pool questions, because this just came into being 2 weeks ago, became effective. So how are we going to choose an FT8 transmitting frequency? All right, well, I gave you the list of frequencies that are typically used for FT8, but they're all 3 kilohertz wide. So how are we going to find out where to transmit within that 3 kilohertz? So in general, find an open spot on the waterfall. Here's a waterfall display that's a part of the WSJTX software. Find an open spot on the waterfall and lock your transmitter frequency there. So it's kind of hard to see here, but we've got something red and something green. These are referred to as goal posts. So here's a spot on the waterfall that's fairly clear. Nobody's transmitting there. So place and hold the cursor over an open spot, and then shift-click to move the red goalpost. So you come over here, line it up, shift-click, and that'll move the red goalpost to this part of the spectrum. Third, there's a button, also in the WSJTX display software, it says hold TX frequency. It's a little hard to read there, but if you click that box, it'll lock your transmit frequency there, and it won't be moving around the band. It moves around the band when you try to work somebody. It'll try to go to their frequency, but it's better to stay on one that's clear. So you set it there. So now here's some really complicated sounding words. Let me read it and then I'll explain it. Good practice when answering a CQ. Find, in other words, somebody's calling CQ, find a clear frequency during the alternate time slot to the calling station. Okay, remember I said that we're going to transmit for 15 seconds, we're going to receive for 15 seconds. So the idea is if they're transmitting a CQ in the first time slot at the 0 to 15 second point, you don't want to be transmitting at the same time, right? Because neither one of you would be able to hear the other one. So you'd want to wait till the other person is finished transmitting before you reply. So let's see if this makes more sense now. Good practice when answering a CQ. Find a clear frequency, that's what we've done here, during the alternate time slot, in other words, when he's not transmitting to the calling station. So hopefully with that explanation, this will make a little bit more sense. And it should jump out at you when you see it in the pool. So here's some operating tips. Here we've got a confused chicken. How in the world am I going to do all of this stuff? Here's a graph up here that Clublog put out some time ago, and it showed what happened when FT8 was released. This is in the first months of use. It was, didn't exist, and all of a sudden it just shot past every other kind of communication mode that was out there. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of contacts were being made on FT8. So operating tips, never transmit on a DX station's frequency. I'll have a document that will go into that in some detail when you get to the point of doing that in your ham radio career. As conditions change, move your transmit frequency to stay in the clear, because people are always jumping in at strange places, and nobody owns a frequency, we know that, but you'll have to be moving around and try to stay in a clear spot. If a needed DX is not answering you, try moving your transmit frequency to another clear spot, because what you see as a clear spot might have interference in Europe, for example. When answering a CQ, the TX even 1 box will change automatically. So there's a box where you can tell the software that you want to transmit on the even time slots or the odd time slots. In other words, 0, 15, 45, etc. The software will automatically adjust that for you. Or you can force it to one specific slot if you're calling CQ. When sending CQ, you can pick the time slot of your transmission. That's what this is referring to. And I made up a new word here, the most awesomest guide to operating FT8 on the planet. And here's a link, the Jim Henson tips. This is kind of a long document, but everything that you want to know about really being effective at working FT8 is in this document. So I'll share that with you. You don't have to get that fancy to start. Whisper. Now notice we've got 2 boys here. They almost look like twins. They're wearing the same shirt. He's not sucking his thumb. He's just cupping his hand around his mouth to keep things secret here. They're whispering to each other. So this mode is called WSPR. It's part of the WSJT-X protocol family. And it stands for Weak Signal Propagation Reporter, WSPR. It probes potential propagation using low power. So the concept is we're going to send a WSPR beacon or a transmission, not really expecting an answer, and that's going to be picked up by automated stations all over the world. Those automated stations will report your signals, your call sign and signal strength to a server that you can then log into and see where you're heard and how loud you are. And you can imagine, first of all, this is just interesting information. Secondly, you can compare antennas. You could work some portable, like my application would be portable antennas. I do a lot of parks on the air stuff. And I'd like to know if my vertical works better than my link dipole, for example. So this is a method I could use to achieve that. So it sends just minimum information, your power level, call sign, and Maidenhead grid square locator that you configure in your software. Listening stations record stations heard to WSPR-net. That's the database server where all of this information is saved. And our common usage is to provide propagation data. And you might have noticed on the color chart, those brand new bands, or relatively new bands, 2200 and 630 meters. Where are you being heard? Because you're limited to 1 watt and 10 watts, I believe, on these bands. So it's excellent for comparing antennas. So this just is kind of all background information so far. Now, and the pool question is, which digital mode is used as a low-power beacon for assessing HF propagation? And the answer is WSPR. Very cool. Moving on to mesh networks. Now, these are interesting because we have ham bands that share space with the commercial Wi-Fi bands. So we've got 5 gigahertz and 2 gigahertz. For example, here we've got a tower. This would be perhaps a major metro area. And because we can transmit at a higher power level, we can go up to 10 watts. And with gain antennas and on towers, we can literally cover an entire city or community. So the idea of a mesh network is, let's say we're wanting to go from here to here. If this link is down, we can achieve the communication via this link. So the idea is a bunch of interconnected stations forming a mesh, and if any individual node goes down, you can get around that through an alternate path. So it can use these frequencies. I mentioned the 2 and 5 gigahertz, also 9 megahertz. Standard internet routers, this is interesting. So if you happen to have a Linksys router that you picked up at a Hamvest, you can get custom firmware for that Linksys router and convert it into amateur use. So standard internet routers with custom firmware. Some people call that ham Wi-Fi. But the transmit side, you can go up to 10 watts, which is much more power than you can on your home internet. And of course, you can put it on a tower. You can cover a town, especially event, or a whole disaster area. That's the concept of mesh networks. So with mesh network microwave nodes, when we say microwave, we're talking about this 3 gigahertz, 5 gigahertz, and so forth. With a mesh network microwave node, if one node fails, a packet may still reach its target station via an alternate route. So that's its big advantage. And these are deployed in several major cities. It's easy to set these up at a disaster location as well. And the primary purpose for mesh networks is to provide high-speed data service during an emergency or community event. And there's a link here, ardenmesh.org. Tons of information about how this works. You might not be interested in doing this right away, but you should know that it exists. And of course, there's a couple of pool questions. All right. Packet-based mode questions. What part of a packet radio frame contains the routing and handling information? Charlie, it's the header. How does forward error correction allow the receiver to correct data errors?
Charlie.
It's Charlie, by transmitting redundant information with the data. In an ARQ mode, what is meant by a NAC response to a transmitted packet? Remember, ARQ stands,
Alpha.
it is alpha. ARQ stands for automatic repeat request. As you're studying this, it might be good to memorize those acronyms. How do you join a contact between two stations using the PACTOR protocol?
Charlie.
It is Charlie. Yeah, it's designed for a one transmit, one receive pair. Joining an existing contact is not possible. PACTOR connections are limited to two stations. Good. That was a good catch. Which of the following describes WinLink?
Delta.
It is Delta. Yeah, I thought we'd catch somebody on this one, but all of these things are true. What is another name for a WinLink remote message server?
Bravo.
Bravo, gateway. We're interfacing to the internet. That's why it's called a gateway. What is VARA?
Bravo.
It is Bravo, a digital protocol used with WinLink. Specifically, it's the software modem that works with the WinLink client. Which of the following is required when using FT8?
Bravo.
Bravo.
This is Bravo, computer time accurate within approximately 1 second. Otherwise, the receiving and transmitting sides would get all confused. What type of modulation is used by FT8?
Alpha.
Alpha.
It is alpha, 8-tone frequency shift keying. Which of the following narrowband digital modes can receive signals with a very low signal-to-noise ratio?
Bravo.
So of the ones given, FT8 is the right answer. What does an FT8 signal report of +3 mean?
Bravo.
It is Charlie.
Charlie.
It's one of those cases where the longest answer will work as well. Which of the following is a common location for FT8?
Charlie.
Charlie.
Charlie, there's our 074 trick again. Yep, digital. Which of the following is a good practice when choosing a transmitting frequency to answer a station calling CQ using FT8?
Charlie.
Delta.
It is Delta. Find a clear frequency during the alternate time slot to the calling station. So we can't be transmitting in the same time slot. That's kind of how you can decode these words. Which digital mode is used as a low-power beacon for assessing HF propagation?
Alpha.
That's alpha. It's our two boys whispering to each other. Which is true of mesh network microwave nodes?
Bravo.
Bravo. If one node fails, a packet may still reach its target station via an alternate route. Now, does anybody think this is easier than Chapter 4? Yeah, I do. We deserve a break today. Okay. What is the primary purpose of an amateur radio emergency data network, or ARDEN, mesh network? Charlie, to provide high-speed data services during an emergency or community event. Section 6.4. This is a fairly short section. All right, so are we using upper sideband or lower sideband? Well, it's kind of set by convention for each mode or mode family. Radio teletype will normally transmit using lower sideband, or LSB. The JT modes, WSJTX family of modes, JT65, etc., use upper sideband always, regardless of which band you're on. Now, there can be some issues in decoding. This kind of sounds like an all of these answer coming up. So why could you have trouble decoding digital messages? Mark and space frequencies may be reversed. We're on the wrong sideband. You may have, oh, no, that's okay. You may have selected the wrong baud rate, or I already gave this away. You may be listening on the wrong sideband because the relationship of the tones and the digital data will be inverted. And this is normally all configurable in software. So if you're trying to talk to somebody and you're not getting the result, you can flip on your side to complete the communication. But these decoding issues you need to be able to recognize. And the sideband, lower for radio teletype, upper for all of the JT modes. Now bandwidth, I like this picture. It's a pond of water and there's water dripping down into the pond. Now the faster the drops are coming, or the harder they're hitting, the greater the disturbance in the pond. That's an easy way for me to see that if we speed up a data rate, we're going to be dropping those drops faster. We're going to create a greater disturbance. It's going to require more bandwidth. It helps me. The FCC rules define the bandwidth of a digital mode signal in the same way as any other signal. Okay, that makes sense. Now, higher symbol rates require wider bandwidth. That's where my analogy helps me. By packing more bits into a symbol, however, the net bit rate can be increased while keeping the symbol rate the same without increasing the bandwidth. A more efficient coding method. The more you disturb the pond, the RF carrier, the greater the waves or the bandwidth. All translating to higher symbol rates require wider bandwidth. So here's some bandwidth numbers for some of the common modes. Let's look at the smallest ones. FT8 we've been talking about a lot, about 50 hertz. Whisper, super narrow, but because it's so narrow, now we said that FT8 took about 15 seconds per cycle. Transmit and then receive. Whisper takes about 2 minutes per cycle, so it's a lot slower, but it's a lot more sensitive. So we've got some of these other ones here, and you'll notice that all of these, even the ones that are the widest, are still under 3 kilohertz, which is the space of a single sideband signal. Our HF is right up there. Pactor is. And then here's some other ones just for comparison. RTTY is about, radio teletype, about 200. Now duty cycle, the symbol down here, what it means is it's a symbol that should be on your transceiver, and it means I'm too young to smoke, okay? You don't want to smoke your transceiver. So some modes have a high duty cycle that could exceed the transmitter's average power rating. Now most transceivers are rated, if you've got a 100 watt transceiver, that's normally considered intermittent commercial amateur service, or ICAS. That means that if you're going to transmit for 1 minute, you have to be receiving for 1 minute so everything can cool down. Now continuous commercial service, or CCS, means you could transmit continuously and it would be perfectly fine. Most of our radio manufacturers are design their equipment around the intermittent commercial amateur service spec. So when you're running radio teletype or FM, which are continuous carrier modes, or CW, if you have the key down and leave it down, that would be continuous. So some models of transceivers or some modes have a high duty cycle that could exceed the transmitter's average power rating. So your transceiver could work just fine on CW at 100 watts or single sideband, but if you were running heavy radio teletype, you might have to back the power down, keep it happy. So RTTY PSK31, nearly 100% duty cycle for extended periods. ARQ modes, less than 100%, but still high. So consider reducing transmitter power to about 50% of maximum for most of the digital modes. And a lot of transceivers will have a temperature reading on them in the metering, so you can tell when they're starting to get hot. Signal mode quality. Well, here's a display, spectrum display. Excess audio levels, those are our enemy, can cause distortion and splatter just as they can for voice modes. In a waterfall display, vertical lines to each side of the main signal indicates over-modulation. We're going to have a picture of the good, the bad, and the ugly coming up. So you want to keep your data audio level set correctly. Over-modulation can cause spurious emissions, and distortion makes a signal harder to copy. So we got to watch this display here. And here I'm going to show you the picture. We got the good, the bad, and the ugly. And here's an article that expands on that somewhat. So good, it's all contained in this little line. The bad, notice we've got these lines going on either side. So that's not good. It's about double the side of what the signal should, double the width of what the signal should be. And here's the ugly, where we've got stuff just splattering all over the place. So you don't want to do that. Now there's a concept called ALC, automatic level control. In sideband, that's a good thing. The louder you talk, the more power your radio is going to try to put out more power for the voice peaks. But with ALC, what that does is it actually reduces the gain of your microphone. It turns down the volume, so to speak, for loud signals. But digital depends upon the louder parts of the signal being in the correct proportion to the weaker parts of the signal. Therefore, ALC can distort the digital signal. So ALC is used to prevent excess drive to the amplifier inputs. Normal ALC action will reduce the transmitted audio level if it's too high, which is going to be bad for digital. Since peaks may become compressed, signals can be distorted. So generally speaking, you don't want to see any ALC action during a digital mode. And on your transmitter metering, you might be digital or analog looking like this is. Normally there's an ALC band someplace there. And in single sideband, it's usually okay if it's bouncing around any place in this band. For digital, you want to turn the audio levels down, the digital tone that's going out on the air. You want to adjust it so that it's not moving the ALC line at all. Digital is much more sensitive to distortion. It'll be harder to decode if it's overdriven. Therefore, the ALC system should be inactive when transmitting an audio frequency shift keying signal data because ALC distorts the signal. So that's an audio level adjustment you need to make in the software. So it says your system, in some radios will let you disable that, which usually isn't a good idea. So you don't want to see ALC activating or ALC bouncing around down here. You want to set the level so that it doesn't get into that area at all. So you want to monitor ALC during digital transmission. There's usually a meter function selection for that. Usually it should not activate during digital. And some transceivers are a little odd. Elecraft is one where you have to be very careful to read the instructions in the manual because some ALC action on an Elecraft is normal for digital. But other than that, these principles apply. All right. What mode is normally used when sending RTTY signals via AFSK with an SSB transmitter? In other words, which sideband?
Delta.
Delta, yeah. Radio teletype, I mean, they've got all these extra words in there, but the bottom line is RTTY is sent on lower sideband. What is the standard sideband for the WSJT modes?
Bravo.
That's the upper sideband, regardless of band, upper sideband. What could be wrong if you cannot decode an RTTY or other FSK signal even though it is apparently tuned in properly?
Delta.
It is delta. All of these things can contribute to the issue. What is the relationship between transmitted symbol rate and bandwidth?
Bravo.
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 Yes. We're disturbing the time-space continuum if you're a Star Trek person. Why is it important to know the duty cycle of the mode you are using when transmitting?
Bravo.
Bravo. Some modes have a high duty cycle that could exceed the transmitter's average power rating. You don't want your radio to smoke. What is indicated on a waterfall display by one or more vertical lines on either side of a data mode or RTTY signal?
Delta.
Delta.
Overmodulation was our good, bad, and ugly diagram. Why should the ALC system be inactive when transmitting AFSK data signals?
Bravo.
Bravo, yep. ALC action will distort the signals. Very detrimental with the digital modes. All right, this is the last section, and then I've got some bonus material that we're going to just share very briefly. Digital operating procedures. Wow, look at all this blue text. System gateways are connection points for digital messaging systems. We saw a picture of that. Here we go. To establish contact with a digital messaging system gateway, transmit a connect message on the station's published frequency. All right, I'll give you some links where you can look up what those frequencies are. These gateways have a published frequency. Oh, these aren't pool questions, they're links. They're blue too. Gateways have published frequencies. And here's where you can see the RMS list for WinLink. For more information, see the WinLink Book of Knowledge. And that's humongous. There's tons of information in that document at this link. And note that WinLink gateways support PACTOR and VARA. They support both of them. Another link there. So I guess there's only just one piece of blue text that you need to be aware of for the pool question. Now, what if the frequency that you want to use is not in that list? We're going to talk about that coming up. Here's some FCC rules. Automatically controlled stations transmitting radio teletype or data may communicate with other automatically controlled stations anywhere in the 6 meter or shorter, so that's 6 meters, 2 meters, going up in frequency, wavelength bands, and in limited segments of the HF bands. And the HF bands, of course, those frequencies are given. So it's possible to do that. When operating under automatic control outside, that's the key word, outside the automatic control band segments, the station initiating the contact must be under local or remote control. Well, when might this happen? Well, the rules and regulations are different outside of the United States. Different countries have different rules. So if there's an automatic control station in Europe and you want to connect with it, you can, but you have to be physically present at the control point. That's what that means. When operating under automatic control outside the automatic control band segments, it's okay to do that, but the station initiating the contact must be under local or remote control. In other words, you've got to be there. Or you have to have direct control of it in case of remote control. Under no circumstances are messages sent via digital modes exempt from Part 97 third-party rules. Well, what's third party? That's a message generated by a non-ham that he wants that message to go to somebody else, someplace else. So under no circumstance are messages sent via digital modes exempt from Part 97 third-party rules that apply to other modes of communication. And then there's a document here that explains all of that, giving you the link to. So PACTOR and VARA are tolerant of some interference or fading, designed for that. Now, symptoms that may result from other signals interfering with a PACTOR or VARA transmission, and be aware that in Europe, that's where you're talking to, they might have interference that they can hear that you can't, or vice versa. So what will happen? Well, we could have frequent retries or timeouts if there's interference, long pauses in message transmission as it's retrying, or failure to establish a connection between stations. So all of this can contribute to transmission difficulties. When a failure to exchange information due to excessive transmission attempts when using an ARQ mode occurs, the connection is dropped. So it won't keep trying and trying forever. It might try for 5 times or 10 times and then it'll disconnect and will stop. It'll give up, which is good because then other people can use those facilities. Waterfall displays. Now here's a really confusing question coming up, and I worked for a couple of years to figure out a way to explain this so that you would get it right when you see it on your exam. All right, waterfall displays. Frequency is horizontal. You'll see 14 megahertz to 14,350. We got the whole 20 meter band, so frequency is horizontal. Next, time is vertical. Notice I've bolded this. If you can remember that time is vertical, you won't get confused when you see the question, because the pool question on this is super confusing. So signals slowly move down the display, showing some history, slowly moving down with time. Time is vertical. Signal strength is intensity. So the stronger the signal is, the brighter it is in color. These red ones are really strong. So this is what we are going to see. What describes a waterfall display? Frequency is horizontal. Signal strength is intensity. Time is vertical. And time is vertical is what you want to be looking for. Otherwise, the questions all sound plausible, the answers. All right. Which of the following is a way to establish contact with a digital messaging system gateway station?
Delta.
Delta, transmit a connect message on the station's published frequency. On what bands may automatically controlled stations transmitting radio teletype or data emissions communicate with other automatically controlled stations?
Delta.
This is delta, right? You're remembering what we talked about, anywhere in the 6 meter or shorter wavelength bands and in limited segments of some of the HF bands. What is required to conduct communications with a digital station operating under automatic control outside of the automatic control band segments? Yep, you need to be there or in direct contact. The station initiating contact must be under local or remote control. Under what circumstances are messages that are sent via digital modes exempt from Part 97 third-party rules that apply to other modes of communications? Never. You don't ever do that. Go directly to jail. Do not pass go. What symptoms may result from other signals interfering with a PACTOR or VARA transmission? Yes, delta. All of those are correct. What action results from a failure to exchange information due to excessive transmission attempts when using an ARQ mode? Bravo. The connection is dropped. It just tries for a certain amount of time and then it drops. Which of the following describes a waterfall display?
Charlie.
Charlie, and hopefully my time is vertical got you there, because these are an awful lot of words and it's terribly confusing. But if you can key in on my little trick, you'll get it. If you can kind of remember what we talked about, you can decode it that way as well, but this is a lot easier. All right, now what I'm going to do is just quickly flip through a couple of these. I'm not going to really spend much time on them because we're close to being out of time. I would encourage you, if you're interested in operating FT8, that you come back to this and read them a bit more carefully than what I'm going to go through them. This is not required for the general exam, but because FT8 is the most popular digital mode out there, you're probably going to want to do this. So I'm just going to have a real fast overview. And before I do that, did you know that your technician license gives you access to the FT8 frequencies on 10 meters? It does. You can do that. I've talked to techs on 10 meters legally. Look at your color band chart. Now this I took last year. This is a shot on 10 meters, FT8 from South Carolina, about a year ago. There were 47 DX stations all decoded in that period. That's amazing. So why is FT8 of interest? Well, new generals need to get on the air. You got to get on the air, folks. Can work the world during solar minimum. We're coming out of a solar peak right now. Making lots of contacts is fun. Making DX contacts is exciting. And you can get great results with a very basic station, just an entry-level transceiver, compromised antennas, and just about all of the software you need is free. Easy to get awards, but you're not going to be talking in a conversation because FT8 is just basic. See, here's our friend again. We saw all of these things already. And here's some stats from a year ago. 2 million contacts over 2 hours, FT8. You can see the other ones diminishing. It's a big time place to be. So here's a picture of what FT8 software looks like. This is a program called JT Alert, which is wonderful because it shows you the names of the countries. And then I like to have a QRZ page up as well. Here's the QSO in progress. Information about it. When it turns red, that means somebody's calling you. There's a tool called PSK Reporter where you can look in the world to see where you were heard, a little bit like Whisper we were talking about. a little more information. You can actually zoom in to where you're talking. What do you need to get started? A transceiver, a sound card, and a computer. Sound card can be in your transceiver. Some more details, what might be needed. And this is how I'm configured. So I've got WSGTX connected to JT Alert, which goes to my software logging program, which automatically uploads to Logbook of the World and ClubLog and does lookups on QRZ. It's pretty easy to configure a system like this. How to get started, I've given you links here for the software that you might need. A little bit more on that. And more, Logbook of the World, the easiest way to confirm contacts. Find an Elmer to get started. And read the manuals. In the advanced tips, I shared the Hinson document again. Find a friend, join some of the forums, and that'll wrap us up for Chapter 6. So next week, I know we went through that in a hurry, but if you're serious about getting into FT8, which you are, I think, go back and look at this. And Gary, what do we do next week?
Ooh, next week, antennas. And I'll show you a standing wave.
Oh.
We talk about them, but you'll get to see one.
All right.
All right, we're out of time.
Yep, right, exactly out of time. And we made it. All right.
See you next week, y'all.
Yep, you betcha.
73.
Yep.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good week.
Can I ask a question?